There's record. Okay. So.
Well, hello there. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we are joined, yes, and I'm actually coming to you. Let me get it out. I'm not coming to you guys from Villers-la-Ville, Belgium. I'm actually coming to you from Australia, Western Australia. And let me just do the land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you along with my guests on the land of the Wadja people of Perth, Australia, the original custodians who never ceded. And my guest today on our All Things Australia, on the program tonight, we return to the country of Australia and we examine ongoing settler colonialism and apartheid. So, in our All Things Australia edition, in our Native Lives Matter episodes, All Things Indigenous Affairs, I am proud to welcome to the program Dr. Carol Dowling of Curtin University, and she's she's going to explain more her background. But let me just say that for a long time she was in the Aboriginal Studies Department at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. She's a long-time foster carer. Right now, she's a senior researcher in the National Drug Research Institute. She's also been a radio show host and a longtime advocate for her people, and she's my guest on the program. So first off, Dr. Dowling, thank you so much for joining me on 1+1, and right here in the studios of Dumbartung, Kyana.
Yeah, Burni Mara, which is good wishes in Buddy my language, because my family are from the central west of West Australia, and which is our region is called Yamaji country, which means it's like saying Europe, basically. And we are sitting on Noongar Buja, which is it's like saying Europe as well, because within Noongar there's all these different family groups as well. So, but I'm a very proud Buddy Maya Marja, which means a leader up in my country. Yeah.
And first question I would like to ask you before we get to all of the important topics that I hope we have time for is just talk to us a bit about your background in that very brief biography I give. So talk to us a bit about your background, all of that, and what you're currently doing nowadays.
Okay, my background is I have been brought up by a single parent mother. My identity comes through my mother's line. And my twin sister and I, we are basically brought up single parent on welfare. So we were brought up in poverty by a mother that was obsessed with education and said this is the only way that you can get out of poverty is by going to school. So we really struggled to get through education, and often it was on the charity of the church. So we, and that charity ended in year 10. But we were very much discouraged for ever even dreaming of going to finish year 12 or go to university. So we were number 2 and number 3 that actually finished year 12.
Wow. And
in our entire family, and then also going to university, yeah.
Unbelievable. And what was... Now, you've always been a long-time advocate, a long-time activist advocate of your people, the Aboriginal people, the Indigenous people of Australia. But university, talk to us about your journey in university and what you did in university, and
right.
and the radio show that you work for sometimes. And
university was really something that. I was told I'd never go to university by my teachers at school. They basically said, the first thing they said was, you're not Aboriginal, you'll never go to university, and you will never attend this special course, which was called an Aboriginal bridging course. And the person that told me all about that was Robert Eggington. He actually came to my high school. And my twin sister and I, they would pull all the Aboriginal girls out of the class to have a yarn to someone from the community to inspire them and encourage them to go to year 12. One day it was Robert Eggington. So
who's been a guest on our program along with his wife, Robert and Selena Eggington, are historians. there are historians, there are activists who have the Dumbartung Kyana Gallery, which is an Aboriginal cultural historical memorial museum, and also a healing center for those who have lost loved ones to suicide, for women who are overcoming the intergenerational trauma, as well as domestic violence and so forth. So they've been on the program before, and yeah.
So I attended the Aboriginal Bridging course at Curtin University, and I was one of the top students there. And then towards the end of that, I was able to gain a traineeship in radio production and announcing at the West Australian Aboriginal Media Association, and I was recruited in the first cohort of the first 6 Aboriginal people ever to be trained in radio here in West Australia. So, and I was the only one that finished that traineeship because of whatever issues that happened with the others. And I ended up becoming a radio producer and announcer for Aboriginal radio. And somewhere in the scheme of there, I ended up working for a Green senator. I finished radio and became working for Senator Christabel Shamaret. I did a lot of community development, starting organisations with my community. But it was around about the time when the Greens held the balance of power in the Senate, the Australian Senate, and they held off the native title legislation as far as they could. And they never stood up and applauded it when it was passed. And when I found out, I said, why didn't you stand up? And they said, because the native title legislation was Swiss cheese and that it wasn't worth even passing. And they were so correct, because subsequent amendments have now seen things like John Howard, the Prime Minister John Howard's 10-point plan, which basically
the 10-point scam, as some people would say.
The scam, yes. So I was heavily involved in the Senate office and was very much learning a lot about the importance of getting a degree. So I went back and got my full degree, and still doing radio production and so forth. But then I became an academic. I hadn't even finished my undergraduate degree, and I was already teaching in units and classes where my non-Indigenous students were actually studying with me in other classes. So it was very bizarre. And then, I entered into public service life. I dabbled in a lot of things, but in my early 20s, I came and worked here at Dumbartung. I was involved as a young person in the production of the second Kyana festival.
Wow.
30,000 visitors came on the 2 days, and I was in charge of 3 marquees myself. Kids' corner at the elders' tent, which we went from the elders to the kids, and also a photographic display, which was showing all the earlier photos. And photos are always a key point for yarning for our mob.
And then one final, one follow-up question before we get to the other topics at hand was, so when you were growing up, from an impoverished Aboriginal community, what decade was that then? And
well, it would have been the 70s, 70s and into the 80s. But see, in my family, my grandmother was stolen off her mother with her younger sister at the age of 12.
The stolen generation.
She was, and put in an orphanage down here in Perth. And it was one of the earlier sweeps of kids that were put in, so it was 1930. And she was basically put in an orphanage to be a slave for the Catholic Church. So she was immediately put into the laundry. So from the time she was 12 until she was 21, she was in a laundry, and she had no education. And the way that it was established there that and subsequently because of my PhD research, when it came to write my chapter about my grandmother, and going to the Catholic Church saying, can I see what happened to her while she was in there? Not a single record except her registration, and her baptism was kept because her father paid money for the church to not have any record of them. So they actually were slaves. So, but I've got generations of domestic servants in my family, including my mother.
Unbelievable. And then and then And so then growing up in your 20s and onwards, that would have been late 1980s and the 1990s?
Yeah, in 1988, I started as a trainee at WAMA, at the Aboriginal Media Association, and that was the year when we had the bicentennial. So, you know, it was a very poignant time for me as a young person I think I was 19 at the time. And I'm now in my 50s and I'm still involved in Aboriginal radio. I'm still doing my own shows, and now I'm back on the board for the radio station. Oh. But along the scheme of things, I got heavily passionate about governance. So starting corporations, starting NGOs, being the chairperson, being the secretary, but predominantly mainly chairperson, and those corporations being quite successful. So I'm very chuffed about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nothing but applause from me. And that's a perfect segue to my first question, which is I wanted to ask you about Aboriginal state of affairs and the real dire conditions. Now, but has the situation in overcoming trachoma been finally dealt with? And from there, just talk to us in general about the current state of affairs facing your people before we talk about the referendum.
Well, I'll just give you an example. I mean, of all the corporations or organisations that I've been involved with, I'll give you an example. Australia's children, Aboriginal children in Australia have the worst ears in the world. They literally do. They're fourth world standards. The benchmark for the World Health Organization is to basically make sure that there's like a 4% ratio of people, of kids being assessed in a population of having ear health. In some of our communities, that rate is up into 30% of kids. And our children spend 34 weeks in their early life not being able to hear. So in doing that, what happens, our children have the burden of such things as not being able to hear, and it impedes their cognitive abilities. They don't do well at school, so because if you can't hear, you can't learn. And so one of the things I got involved with because of my oldest foster son having chronic, because apparently for Aboriginal boys, their little ears they're not made the same as non-Indigenous kids. So the burden of ear disease is longer and harder to grapple with. So my mates, I started an NGO with my friends who are non-Indigenous allies, and we now have a foundation that has ear buses called the Earbus Foundation of WA that travels and has buses that go to remote communities all over WA grappling ear health. And we now have wonderful results where kids are actually what they call a nap plan at school. So the schools absolutely love us because the kids are engaging. Ipso facto, they have more ability to attain educational qualifications, less likelihood of going into jail or prison or having social problems, and their families are also having hope and encouragement to see their children doing well at school and they're not so sick. So just that as a corporation, as an organisation in itself, is a game changer, and that's an NGO. And I thoroughly believe that is the missing link, is that we do need to have non-Indigenous allies helping us with us, with the skills and knowledge to focus on particular issues happening in our community. And it works. It bloody works. The private sector and NGOs are probably the only way that you're going to see real change. You're not going to get it from the government. They have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. You can bet on it that they will use that as an opportunity for what they've already done here in Australia with the referendum.
Unbelievable.
Is they want to maintain the industry, and that's what we call it. Aboriginal Affairs in this country is an industry.
Yeah.
It pays mortgages for non-Indigenous people and and some of our own mob that are in those structures as well. But the reality is our people have to be kept in the position they're in to maintain the status quo, because a lot of money goes into Aboriginal affairs, billions of dollars goes into Aboriginal affairs, and that's one of the arguments for the referendum. They were saying that, you know, they were asking Aboriginal people where the money was, for goodness sake. We get something like 5% of any of that money, and obviously the status quo is maintained. So
unbelievable.
It's shocking.
And before we get into the referendum, what's the state of eradicating, or certainly radically, eradicating the trachoma?
Of trachoma?
Yeah.
Well, see, trachoma, as well as things like rheumatic heart fever, those issues are not faced in the first world, are they? But why are they being faced in a country that is like one of the biggest economies in the world? Why are our people still facing such fundamentally, fourth world health issues? You know, my great grandmother died of rheumatic heart fever. It's a horrible way to die. Why are our kids just dropping off from things like rheumatic heart fever and losing their eyesight? I remember once as a young person in radio going up to communities in the Kimberley and doing broadcasting up there, and we went to one place called Turkey Creek. It's called something else now, and I sat down in the camp, little fair-skinned mob like me, sitting down with all these traditional owners, these old people, and I said, well, I asked the person that I was with, I said, why have they only got one eye? A lot of these elders, why have they only got one eye? Yeah. And this was, we're talking about the 80s, okay? So a lot of these old people probably passed, and they explained to me that when the eye surgeon comes up there, they say, which eye do you want to keep? You know? So the implications, people have no idea what it's like for our communities, the racism, the systemic neglect, people who, for example, make their wonderful little the little mini fiefdoms in Broome or these regional centres like that, never hardly leave there, yet the people out in the communities they're supposed to represent are struggling, like they, have no regular intervention or whatever health issues being addressed out in these remote communities. But places like Airbus does, we go out there.
That's. I shouldn't say it's unbelievable, but it is unbelievable. Having
and then you've got people like the Prime Minister of Australia,
current one or
former one. What was his name? Oh, I couldn't stand
John
him.
Howard,
they had the big ears.
Tony Abbott
of
the Liberal Party.
He viewed our remote communities as a lifestyle choice, that our people were there by choice. Nothing about the fact that our very essence of these people, our identity, is based on a particular geographic location. Our very identity is tied into the dreaming and the spiritual beliefs that are connected to that country. We are genetically connected to that country, that particular country. But that's a lifestyle choice, according to Tony Abbott. And that's why they wanted to shut them down, those communities.
That's... before I get to this question, I'll just say that I have followed, Aboriginal affairs and, in Australian history and politics for quite a long time. I should not be shocked at anything I find out, but having come here to Perth and to spend a lot of time with our dear friends and comrades, Robert and Selena Eggington, and talking to other people who are Aboriginal, and what they tell me about the state of institutional racism and so forth, my response is always unbelievable. That's unbelievable, and it's always worse than you think it is. So even if you've read the Henry Reynolds books, even if you've seen John Pilger's body of work, and even if you follow, left wing Australian media, something like New Matilda or Green Left Weekly, you think, okay, it's bad, but then coming here and actually speaking to people, it's always much worse than you think. Right?
But not only that, to actually understand the very notion of Aboriginality our identity is tied into stories of survival. That's who we are. We have these stories intrinsically, and they are told at kitchen tables, you know, with your nana there and everyone talking about how they survived and what they are surviving with now. You know, it's actually innately who we are. But those stories are never actually understood or even cared about by the dominant culture. But they are our essence. They are a part of us. It shouldn't be. And our very identity has become like this, it's open fodder, you know, people to explain or try to tell us who we are all the time, or that we shouldn't be who we are and that we should assimilate, we should become like white people. But to us in our community, that is like a sheer path to mental illness, seriously.
Exactly.
And we still experience mental illness because if you have everyday racism dealing with it, none of that stuff makes sense. Racism is insanity. It doesn't make sense. You know, when you're the brunt of it, how can you make sense of it? How can you recover from it? It's trauma.
I'm going to switch the questions around and let's actually talk about So I'm going to switch the questions around and talk about the recent referendums. I'll try to give a brief explanation. So basically, very recently in Australia, I think early October, I think around October the 5th, Australians, you know, got the chance to vote in a referendum and the referendum was whether Aboriginal people should be included in the Constitution and be given some kind of representation, what they call a parliamentary voice, to help with the federal government and local government on Aboriginal affairs. And it was defeated. It was defeated, so my question is, what's your response? If there's anything I missed in explaining,
yes,
add to it, and then what's your reflections on the defeat of having Aboriginal voice in the Constitution?
Well, firstly, it was actually every single Australian citizen was expected to vote, and it wasn't an election. It was actually a vote,
referendum, yes.
To actually change the original document, which is actually still has racism in it, because it gives the power of the federal parliament or anyone to actually make laws that specifically impact Aboriginal people, or it's race-based. That's how they did the intervention in the Northern Territory. You see what I'm saying? So to actually say that we're the first people in there and to actually say that we need a voice over our own affairs, it wasn't much of a big ask. In fact, it was a humble invitation for our people to walk with the rest of Australia. And that invitation was slapped away. It really was, because it just really shows the influence, not only social media and how the sort of Trump mentality of running a campaign absolutely worked. It really worked.
Far-right network.
Yeah. And as someone within community, it's such a frustrating time, because who've run corporations, a lot of our corporations are very vital. We're not just talking little fluffy organisations. These are ones that fundamentally look after justice, health, our children, you know, all these things are really about...
Like the Aboriginal legal affairs.
Yeah, the medical service, you know, these are organisations that keep us alive as best we can, despite the horrendous statistics that our people experience. Western Australia has one of the worst statistics for our population as First Nations in the whole of Australia.
In terms of poverty, in terms of health, life expectancy, people not going to universities, people incarcerated, which we're going to talk about. Out of home care, so children are actually being removed at astronomical numbers and being placed out of their communities. And as a foster carer, a long-term foster carer, I became a foster carer 20 years ago because there was not enough Aboriginal foster carers. So I was very concerned about how these kids are going to be brought up
understanding who they are, their place in the community, because our very identity is actually you're brought up with a database in your head.
Go on.
You're actually brought up with a database. When you are in your family, you're brought up with a database in your head about who you're related to, and you must know that stuff for you to engage in the community. And if you are not brought up with that in care, your very sense of who you are as an Aboriginal person is compromised. And so, you know, my understanding for Western Australia in particular is that we're at a position now, and it's so important for our corporations or for any of us in the community. The voice is what we needed. We needed to have that self-determination. But because it was going to be really a challenge for Australia's democracy to actually listen to their constituents in a pure sense and make sure that we have a say in what happens to us, it was too much for them, too much for the dominant culture to accept and to agree. But in a way, I always look at things negatively as being a positive thing, because it really is putting a light on us. And I'm glad that someone like yourself has come from far and afield to actually say, okay, what's really going on? And I'm telling you, mate, because we're such an isolated, not just us as the most isolated capital city in the world, but Australia is isolated. You know, we don't have another country next to us to say, you're full of crap. What are you doing? We don't have that. There's this real arrogance, this real entitlement that the dominant culture has towards First Nations people. And it's that hearkening back to like, why don't you disappear? You just want our backyard. Talking about the Uluru Statement, which was an invitation, as a declaration of war? Seriously? So there's like this real strong sense of, us being asking too much. I mean, it's really a conscious shift that a lot of people weren't prepared to do. But I do have confidence in those that did. I feel that we've got so many more allies now, and I think it's a matter of time.
So from what I'm hearing for you, you were definitely an advocate of an advocate of yes. Aboriginal people,
but at the same
Constitution, even if it wasn't going to change everything overnight, but it certainly was a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So do you feel then that? That those, Australians who voted, because I know that the Socialist Equality Party, this Australian Marxist Trotskyist party, they weren't supportive of the referendum of a yes. I believe they advocated no. Lydia Thorpe, a prominent Aboriginal senator, she also advocated for no. But do you feel that, okay, yes, voting yes and amending the Constitution, even if it's a racist Constitution, but just amending that we are including the Constitution. Yes, it wasn't going to solve everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. And now that it's been defeated, those, white socialists who voted no, and even somebody like Lydia Thorpe who encouraged Aboriginal people to vote no, you have just created huge setbacks for universal land rights and, or a treaty, a radical anti-colonial treaty. Australians voting no, the mostly white Australians, but even persons of color Australians who all mostly voted no, have just created a huge setback for any kind of.
But not only that, it's emboldened racism, and I mean, I've lost count now of how many young people are experiencing it very blatantly. Like for example, my foster son who lives with me, I've had him since he was 7 months old. He's now 16. And he went to school the other day and heard one of his teachers talking about the referendum. And it was like and they were in his earshot. He's the only Indigenous person in his class, and he heard the teachers say, well, I'm glad that's over because it would have cost a lot of money. And I thought, why you're not making it culturally safe in the classroom by saying that. But obviously because they were vindicated, they felt they are able to actually say what they want to say now. And in fact, I'm really concerned about that. I really do believe that we have enough everyday racism without having that happen, you know?
How much does the Australian corporate state media play? How much do you think how they covered it, how they framed the referendum debates, how much of that do you think played an influence in the no vote, as well as in general the everyday racism and the institutional racism that Aboriginal people face in Australia?
I think a lot of it is still very right wing. A lot of our media, the mainstream media,
and far right, we should say. I mean,
yeah, I'd say moderate to far right, yeah. And in fact, when they do have First Nations people on there, it's always framed with humour, and it's not like, you know, you don't literally, you can only see real genuine debate on channels such as SBS or ABC, but mainstream media, free to air, whatever, it generally turns out to be one where the voice of fairness and justice is very rarely presented. And I find that I just know that the status quo can't be maintained forever. It's you've got so many people coming from overseas coming to stay in Australia, particularly people of colour. And I can remember when there was a big onslaught of Africans actually coming to us, Perth, and I was thinking, yes, more black people on the street, you know, because we're often very hidden as First Nations people.
And it's because it's important to add, sorry to interrupt, it's important to add this, that Australia, yeah, it's a white settler colonial country, and of course Aboriginal people have faced the worst of it, but also during the founding of Australia there was what was called the White Australia policy. So the only immigration, and it was still strict, but the only immigration that Australia allowed was, yeah, white people from England, white people from, you know, Italy, France, Holland, and whatnot. So that's why that's why it's important to add that it ended. It ended in the 70s. When Gough Whitlam was coming into power. But it's important to add.
But that time wasn't just about immigration too. That White Australia policy applied to Aboriginal people as well, and in fact, a lot of those really severe legislated oppression actually occurred during that time as well. In particular, for our communities, the 1905 Act in West Australia in particular was horrendous. No freedom of movement. You had to get permission to who you could marry. Your children were immediately at birth wards of the state.
That sort of stolen generation comes from this.
No freedom of travel. You had to get permission to go and work somewhere. And this is the time that my grandmother lived in and my mother, okay? They were brought up in that system. So, and it was just, you know, the influence upon race relations was forged then. So what we're seeing is a manifestation of that. So all those non-Indigenous people that were immigrants during the White Australian policy, the white immigrants, they are the voters. They are the people that legislated, that perpetuate that racism. There's a sense of privilege, you know. It's very strong. Yeah,
the whole entitlement, like, I came to Australia and I wasn't given any handouts, so why should Aboriginal people should be given any handouts? I'll tell you why. I mean, this is their land and they got dispossessed, but so there's a lot of that.
The other element to think about too, and I was having a yarn to a young mum about it last night, and she had no idea about the history of, I love educating our younger women, you know. And I've been to the births of 3 of her babies, but I always put these little seeds of knowledge to her. And I was explaining how it was illegal for our people to own property, okay? It was legal for Aboriginal people to be in inherited wealth. So we had generations of non-Indigenous people being left their houses and whatever like that. But for us, that was illegal. And it was also illegal to go to university. There was all these real oppression, proper oppression. And my mother would often talk about how, she was able to circumnavigate a lot of that real restrictions because she was a fairer skinned person, but so much harder for my grandmother,
But then I have to ask this question, which is it safe to say that the history wars are still alive and well in Australia? And the history wars was, when after Gough Whitlam's brief premiership, and then we had I'm blanking on the Liberal who replaced him, but then we had the rise of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, all of the Labour Party, and I'm not, and Labour is just as bad as the Liberal National Party when it comes to Aboriginal affairs. I call them a rival oligarchic party and a rival settler colonial party. That being said, at least with Bob Hawke, he did say that he was going to give universal land rights, got defeated. At least with Paul Keating, he said that we do need to recognize that we have a brutal colonial past and we need to forge forward for a better tomorrow. That's where the whole reconciliation industry comes about. Kevin Rudd did apologize for the stolen generations. And as we see with Anthony Albanese, he proposes that we should amend the Constitution and say that this land originally belonged to Aboriginal people and they deserve a voice in Parliament. But after Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, you had, and even during their time, you had the rise of the History Wars, which was a group of white supremacist academics and commentators and journalists say that there was no that there was no generation, no dispossession of Aboriginal people, no stolen generations, and even if there was racism, Aboriginal people should be grateful as their way of life was becoming obsolete, and they should be grateful that we gave them capitalism.
Well, we're really talking about Keith Windschuttle. Now, Keith Windschuttle is not an academic. He's very much funded by the Bennelong Society, which is such a horrible name to use because Bennelong was an incredible person, an original resistance fighter and advocate, original warrior.
I did not know that.
And them using his name like that is such an anathema. Seriously, it's just such an insult. But Keith Windschuttle was the one that was challenging people like Henry Reynolds. Now, Henry Reynolds is a dear friend of mine and my sister painted him for the Archibald Prize. And attacking him about, whether his accounts of what really happened, which were the very first time anyone had actually challenged the notion of the frontier. Incredible theorist and writer. And he's the one that wrote books called Why Weren't We Told and things like that. So the first time he had people writing about it. But now we have another front where we've got people like I keep forgetting his name, but what's his name? He wrote about the fact that we invented making flour and dough. What was his name? Oh God, I keep forgetting. But they started questioning his validity about what he said, and that he in fact wasn't Indigenous. So they're now talking about another sort of challenge to a counter history. So yeah, I don't think the history wars are over. I don't. I think it's too much. It's too much.
And that definitely, and stupid question, but you think that definitely influenced people who voted no in the referendum?
Yes, I do. But I really do believe what it is that they're not giving, that was the one thing that The Voice could possibly present is this notion of a formalised truth-telling process. That's what I was really hoping would happen. Because that's what the Uluru said. It said voice, truth-telling, and then treaty. There was a process. It was a roadmap that could have easily been followed. Nothing too hard, but what people didn't realise is that only, ironically, 60% actually won the vote. But guess what? Only 60% of the general Australian non-Indigenous population have never, ever, 60% have never, ever met an Aboriginal person. 60% of have never met an Aboriginal person. So it correlates because they don't have any knowledge of us, they don't know us, and I'm sure that if they did, with whatever,
they're being fed they're being spoon-fed a diet of shock rock, far radio, and if not that, it's an Andrew Bolt. If it's not that, they're reading the Australian, they're reading the Daily Telegraph, they're reading. They're watching Sky Australia and reading a lot of the Murdoch press, and if it's not a Murdoch, it's a Kerry it's a Kerry Packer type of person. The referendum, I hope I got my statistics right. 39.4% yes, 60.60% no. Even though there were a lot of radical left Aboriginal voices who expressed. Who also voted no because they said that this is a distraction. We need a treaty right away. But 18% of Aboriginal people voted yes, and an overwhelmingly amount of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders voted yes. And
particularly in communities, remote communities. And that was the very place that, people like Dutton was saying would never happen. These remote communities don't want this, blah, blah, blah. And yet it's undeniable that a lot of these remote communities actually did vote with their feet. 80, 90% some of these communities voted yes. It's just shocking. It is really shocking.
Unbelievable.
And I think, as time goes on, because it's still very new here in Australia about the vote, I have quite a little quiet confidence that that the allyship that we've formed through the referendum process will have feet. I really do believe that.
I have to ask this: what was the role of the largely and mainly white Australian union? So like a teachers union or the trade unions. Were a lot of them overwhelmingly for no or for yes?
I actually came across quite a few that were pro referendum. Yes, they were voting very much supporting it. Often it was framed around like, you need to be informed. You need to get yourself out there and learning about what's going on for First Nations people. I think it was the Teachers Union was the most powerful. I absolutely loved a lot of what they were saying on TikTok. It was just the most beautiful stuff I've ever seen because they put a lot of time and effort into some of those messages. But they didn't have people like, Gina Reinhardt funding their campaign,
How much of special interest groups, the mining industry, the fossil fuel industry, how police unions, stupid question, but did a lot of them fund the no?
Surprisingly, a lot of mining companies actually backed yes, they did. But at the same time, and that was one of the questions that they had. A lot of people were, and that was the campaign that the far right did anyway. They were saying you've got big business backing you to the yes vote, but in reality, you couldn't get any more bigger than Gina Reinhardt. Seriously, multi-millionaire, the richest person in Australia, backing it.
That reminds me so much of the Brexit referendum, and even though yes, the European Union, you can argue, is a neoliberal institution, and yes, it has passed horrendous laws, and yes, it's not this wonderful socialist, even liberals, capital L liberal institution, but still, I mean, if I was British, Scottish, or Northern Irish or Welsh, I would have voted yes to remain because I liked the messaging of the EU-led reformists vastly more than what was coming out of the no campaign. you did have a lot of the left who were what we called Lexiteers. They wanted a left exit, and but that being said, most of the Brexit voices, the Leave voices, these are people like Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson. It was the far right of the Tory party, but the argument was that big business was funding the Remain campaign, and yes, there was divisions between those between big business that wanted to stay in the European Union and big business that wanted to leave the European Union. But that being said, I mean, yeah, it's like, talk about projection. Like, you guys are back to the teats by the Murdochs of the world. We may have George Soros and we may have Goldman Sachs, but you guys are, which is why I was.
But can I just say the debate is different for Brexit, because Brexit is ultimately about money, isn't it? But we're here in Australia, there was no vested interest by non-Indigenous people, the dominant culture. There was none. There was no investment, so they didn't understand the seriousness of it and what it meant. It was just very much like this cartoon I actually saw once about what happened, and they have an image of an Aboriginal person pushing their hand out saying heal, as in H-E-A-L, but then they had the non-Indigenous person saying heal, as in you will get down like a trained dog and you will do as you're told. You see what I'm saying? That's the two different perspectives.
And yet those the bigoted white working class voters. So they claim a lot of them will say no government ever gave me a handout, and when my parents came here legally from England or Spain or something, we weren't given any handouts by the government. But then it's like, well, but then why? So okay, then why are you supportive of the Liberal Party, the National Party, or the right wing of the Labour Party, who are advocates of the 1%ers of the world?
But for us,
the global plutocrats of the
world. All
it
showed to me as a First Nations writer and academic is I really think there's a deficiency in critical thinking by the general population, because how can a group of people who have the lowest possible socioeconomic status in the whole of Australia, cannot get any worse in a position, how is it that those people have, the most money? Have they spent the money somewhere? Well, the reality is...
Well, even the suffering isn't shared equally. This is what gets under my skin the most when we talk about the apartheid that Aboriginal people face, Maori people, the Sami people, Native Americans, First Nations, Canadians, Inuits, and Métis, is even the suffering isn't shared equally, because I would rather be, and I often argue this with black people, in America, that yes, it sucks the Jim Crow we live under, but still, it's a 5-star hotel compared to what Native Americans have to deal with. I would rather be a poor black Canadian, or a poor white person in Canada than somebody of an Indigenous background. And there are more Indigenous people. It's the fastest growing population in Canada compared to a black Canadian.
And yet these myths perpetuate throughout Australian society that Aboriginal people get free cars.
Not true.
Free houses.
Not true.
Free education. To some extent, well, actually, no, we don't. We still have to pay HECS back. We still get the level of financial support just like non-Indigenous people when we go to uni. Same. And the reality is, it just perpetuates this idea that we are somehow in our poverty privileged. It does not make sense. It does not make sense. And if you are a critical thinker, you will see that. You will say it doesn't make sense. This whole fallacies that are perpetuated about our mob,
Unbelievable. And I have to ask this question. So two briefly before we wrap up is the Northern Territory intervention still in place? And and to our and then briefly explain to our audience what was the NC intervention, and are a lot of the grotesque policies like the basics card still in place in the Northern Territories?
I do know of it still existing here in Perth, in metropolitan Perth. Yeah, so I'd say that legislation still perpetuates. Not to an extent it was. See, the whole reality, it was brought in because there was this conspiracy brought about by Tony Abbott that there were pedophile rings in our communities. That was quashed within a very short period of time, that it was an absolute white tiger, and it was created to create fear about our remote communities. And have a guess what they're bringing up now post-referendum. A royal commission
into Aboriginal men engaging in systemic abuse and whatnot. And folks need to watch Utopia and read the journalism of Chris Graham, formerly of National Indigenous Times and New Matilda. I'll make sure to post a link to that. But even Olga Havin, who did some big research into remote Aboriginal communities, they found that Aboriginal communities, despite the extreme impoverishments and whatnot, had the lowest rate of child abuse. Unbelievable. And you don't see John Howard or anyone sending down tanks into the Catholic Church to their systemic abuse of children, or the Magdalene Aslams for that.
And that is just so intimidating to see the military entering in these communities that are already impoverished. I mean, the intimidation, seriously, people are already traumatised, it's shocking. I just wish that there would be some sort of international support for us, because what we have to endure here and our children, and that was exactly what the Uluru Statement from the Heart was about. It was always forefront. Please think about our kids and what they have to deal with.
That's a perfect segue to this question I wanted to ask you, which is, what do you think it's going to take for what do you think it's going to take for the white Australian left, white socialists, white Marxists in Australia, the eco-justice movement, those who are involved in Palestine solidarity and anti-imperialist issues? So broadly, the white socialist left, eco-left, feminists and whatnot, what do you think it's going to take for them to show more urgent solidarity to Aboriginal people, given given their raison d'etre is anti-capitalism and it's tearing down imperialism, and yet right here in Australia, all of that is rooted in settler colonialism and the dispossession and the apartheid that Aboriginal people face.
Well, I had the privilege in my role as an academic to be able to mark dissertations of students that are studying human rights. And so one time I actually got a dissertation that I marked about this guy who raised the issue of, is it possible that self-determination and sovereignty can happen in Australia? And you know what he said? And which is a wonderful analogy, and I thoroughly agreed with him. This is a non-Indigenous guy, so one of the enlightened allies out there. So I want to give hope to people out there that you're obviously addressing this too. He said the ones that will really create change is the private sector, so business, and non-government NGOs, so non-government organisations that work in partnership in pure cross-cultural collaboration with First Nations people, bearing in mind that our people are heavily taxed for time, for energy, for even just the will to keep going. But you, as a non-Indigenous person, you have that energy and resources. You've been brought up in experiences where we have never had that opportunity. So if you can just change your focus and work to make what we want, be our voice, help us have a voice in these organisations, form corporations. I'm telling you now, you get passionate about governance, you get passionate about it. Our people need to be working with non-Indigenous people who are our brothers and sisters, okay? They are our allies, and there's a reason why they're called allies. You see?
Do you think Australia will ever get to the point where New Zealand is at? And I know things are not all hunky-dory in New Zealand with the plight of Maori people, and I know, I know white socialists, Marxists who say that the treaty in New Zealand has only brought about, Maori capitalism and so forth. But all that being said, race relations in New Zealand are vastly better than Australia, Canada, and the United States put together. So when do you think Australia will get to the point where it's like New Zealand or Canada, where there is no genocide, denialism, and where the white left shows urgent solidarity to the plight of Indigenous people?
Good question. I thoroughly believe that what we're dealing with is a moment in Australian history where the tough questions are going to be asked, whether we like it or not. And I actually think that it's still too early days for the ramifications of this referendum, and I thoroughly think that this notion, this fallacy that we spread about Australia being the place of the fair go, this is not going to be. This is not a fair country. This is not a fair go, and we are now seeing. But I don't know. I always think about TikTok because it's so powerful now. Social media is powerful. There are a lot of people that have this beautiful starry-eyed vision of moving from America or England or whatever and coming to Australia, and they are being exposed to a whole different way of looking. Oh, people are so friendly here. The animals are so interesting and amazing, and that this country is this utopia. But in reality, we are talking about a very insidious part of this country that has been created on the oppression of the oldest living culture on the planet.
Exactly.
And why is that not being embraced? Just in my own family and the knowledge that I had to, all of us as First Nation people probably go through a process of decolonisation, and we do it on a daily basis because everyday racism is often very subtle and blatant at the same time. But when you decolonise, it's like a tapestry. I always do this metaphor with my students. It's like a tapestry, an ornate tapestry of Aboriginal culture that has been finely woven for generations and centuries, thousands of generations. Colonialism is like stab wounds to that tapestry. Random, violent, almost impossible to repair. What we do as First Nations people, often probably with the help of our allies, is to find something that threads to repair those holes. It'll never be the same as what it was, but it's ours and we make it together. We repair that damage that's done. But that tapestry is so ornate and unique and enriching, and we need it. We need it to survive in this country. If we are going to have summers where the temperature's in the 50s, our water supply goes, the sea levels rise, what knowledge do you need? You need the tapestry. You need that tapestry to be repaired, because that knowledge that we have of particular ecosystems, us as First Nations Australian, as custodians, we are generous enough and as still generous enough to lead everyone, or to work with everyone to care for the country, for our country.
And would you say that it's also long overdue that the international left and people power movements focus on Australia and show urgent solidarity to Aboriginal people? And I would also say that there also needs to be an international left that also shows urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans. I know my friend Alfred Desaias, UN Special Rapporteur who studied the political crisis in Venezuela and later spoke out against the sanctions. He said, he has said on the air and off the air many times that there needs to be Native Lives Matter movement, and there needs to be an international solidarity Native Lives Matter movement for Native Americans, Indigenous Canadians, Aboriginal Australians, Maori, and others from the Sami people to Indigenous Brazilians, Chileans, and whatnot. Do you agree with them on that?
Most definitely, yeah. I think that would be the imperative for a pan-Indigenous solidarity.
Yeah,
we've learnt a hell of a lot as ourselves, as Aboriginal people in Australia, by travelling and seeing how people in other countries have manoeuvred colonialism and how they've adapted to ways of still having self-determination. But I think here, particularly in Australia, because we are such a small minority, but at the same time, you know, it's intrinsic to the nature of this country. People have become the dominant culture, whether they appreciate it or not. They have been colonised by Aboriginal people, okay? In a sense. I often say this when I go into a classroom. Yeah. I freak my non-Indigenous students out often by saying, I'm here to colonise you and assimilate you, you know? And then they look at me and say, well, yeah, but you're fair-skinned. You know, how are you possibly going to do that? And I say things because I'm a spy, I say. I am here to infiltrate your way of thinking because I was brought up
and decolonize their minds.
That's right, and it really does shock them when you use the metaphors of the dominant culture. But often when I do get challenged about my being a fair-skinned blackfellow, I often say, well, I'm a product of the breeding out program. And you can't tell me, and I often see this with my students, they know exactly what I'm talking about. They know exactly what I'm talking about. They can't assume that it's not, because that whole attitude of the breeding out or the dying out of First Nations people, that those beliefs still exist and permeate Australian society, and we're not going to go away. We're just not going to go away.
We end the program with the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust and later Bernard Pivot, popular French broadcaster, and James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. It is your turn, Dr. Carroll, to do this. So here we go. So Doctor, what is your favorite word?
It would be kindred.
What is your least favorite word?
No, you're not.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Children.
What turns you off then?
Old angry white men.
Here. Then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
I don't like the sound of industry. I just think it's not important. But I love the sound of birds.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And what is your favorite curse word? You can say, and if you want, you can say it in whatever Aboriginal language would be a curse word.
Oh gosh, noich.
Noich. Is that an Aboriginal word, or what does it mean?
I think it means penis or something.
Okay. And then, what profession would you love to do?
I would love to go to the UN.
Work in the United Nations for Indigenous. I would imagine Indigenous.
Advocacy. if I wasn't so tied to my community, and the kids. Maybe when the kids grow up, I'll have a go at it, because I've got a lot of good friends that go to the UN.
Fantastic.
They've asked me to go.
I'll have to get you in touch with Dr. Alfred Desaias then. And then, what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
To work for child protection.
Yes, the child services, the Australian child services.
No, it's just a progression of native welfare to me.
I completely agree with you. And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist or an agnostic, please feel free to answer this question.
You are one of the ancestors now. Oh, thank you. I'll get a clap.
We were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Dr. Carol Dowling, who used to be a professor at Curtin University in Perth, and she is now the senior researcher for the National Drug Research Institute, and she is still a prominent activist and advocate for her people. Dr. Dowling, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real honor. Solidarity forever to your Indigenous people, and Native Lives Matter and power to the people, and death to settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism.
Yes, and I encourage anyone to come to our beautiful place, our beautiful country, and connect with us, Mob, and we'll take you out to see some incredible things.
Yes, and come to Perth, visit Dumbartung, Kyana. It will be money well spent.